What we're talking to you about is our sub-project within the larger project, which is about traditional knowledge and biocultural labels. And Stephanie and I bring very different sorts of resources and skills, as you'll see in a minute. We want to start, obviously, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today. We also want to acknowledge that this presentation draws heavily on the work of Local Context and Enrich, which you'll learn about more if you don't know already in a minute. We want to acknowledge more generally all of the work that Aboriginal, First Nations, Torres Strait Islander peoples have done and continue to do in achieving Indigenous data sovereignty. And so the project we're doing is very much trying to provide a scaffold in a way for supporting these efforts. We also acknowledge the influence and the impacts of both our personal points of view and our institutional positionality. We're non-Indigenous people. We are working closely with the broader team and others in our organizations who are themselves Indigenous, coming from a range of communities. But we do understand that, of course, our positionality affects the ways in which we listen, learn, and what we bring to the topic. So we just wanted to note that to start. So a quick overview of our sub-project. What we're trying to do has sort of three parts. One has to do with the labels and the so-called notices, and we'll go into this in more detail later. It has to do with ways in which we might utilize these labels and thinking about how they might work or they might not work in the Australian context, and in particular looking at people who might be users or collaborators for use of these labels in a range of types of collections. The second thing is thinking about a lot of what was discussed earlier about metadata and catalogs, ways in which metadata might work in these sorts of contexts, and the connections between labeling and language, vocabularies, ontologies, and so on. Our approach then is to use case studies looking at particular types of collections or particular communities or organizations that have data, whether it's not a formalized collection, to think about ways in which either the data could work through traditional knowledge labels or biocultural labels, or limitations to using that system. We want to look at various forms of collections that cross the various streams within the project and much more broadly. So we're talking about everything from biological, scientific, cultural, linguistic language collections, and so on. We'll see a few examples in a minute. We're not trying to actually do this. What we want to do is start to develop a roadmap for how it might be done in the future and what resources would need to be in place. So Steph's going to take you through a few of the underlying concepts.
Brilliant. And I think it's been wonderful to, in some ways it's hard to come at the end, but it's been also great to hear all the things that are going forward. So some of these sections I'm going to talk about here now really draw on or sort of riff off some of those previous things. We've heard a lot about the sort of landscape around Indigenous data, and looking at it from an institutional or governance perspective, there are a number of different initiatives, and I really think we need to sort of look at how we're connecting with one another and that sort of coordinated resourcing and strategy. We've heard that there's a lot of, resourcing that needs to happen at the local and the community level to support not just the government, what the government's doing. It has lots of money, can always find lots of money, but I think some of those platforms that are being used by communities and, the data units, the data resources, the data managers, I think that needs to be supported. We know that that works in a context of the work that the IDN is doing, the work that Miamnyari Mungara is doing, and also the international space as well. And those platforms that sit there from a data collection or a data sharing perspective, I'm aware of a few smaller ones that institutions are using, Keeping Place, Keeping Cultural, from looking at that cultural information, some of the land management work. But even we've heard from the group in Brisbane as well, the use of Microsoft Azure and those types of platforms to manage data. But again, there's those bigger platforms that are out there too in terms of data.gov, where government meant to put a lot of its data through to things like AATSIS and the AUSTLANG as well. So I just wanted to use a sort of CSIRO as a bit of an example as well. We are a massive big organisation which have phenomenal amounts of data, from observational data, survey-based data. We hold the national biological collections, from the insect collection, the wildlife herbarium. We have earth observations. We have sensors, all these sorts of things. So we have a phenomenal amount of data, and in various different forms, and we analyse that data in many different ways. And we're also, as a government agency, you know, we have a responsibility to make that data available in an open or publicly available. And we do that through various different mechanisms, and a lot of other institutions will do that too. We have, for instance, our own data access portal where all our data is available to be downloaded. We have our publications repository as well. But we also work on a number of different projects where there's project-specific data that may have been collected. You may have seen the Northern Australia Water Resource Assessment. There's an e-atlas, for instance, that looks at some of the data coming out of the north and the GBR, and a big piece of work that was done around bioregional assessments looking at water resources across the country. But again, we also feed into national repositories or national aggregators. For instance, data.gov. Atlas of Living Australia is a good example. It's a sort of a sister organisation to ARDC that looks at biodiversity information. CSIRO hosts that as well. And TURN is another example, again, about that sort of biological survey-based data. So as a national organisation, we're meant to make our data available, and there's so much of it, and virtually you could argue that most of it, if not all of it, is Indigenous data in one form or another. At the same time, there are other institutions like IATSIS holds, and here we're looking at where potentially could the TK and the BC labels apply as well. So you've got IATSIS, for instance, that holds objects, cultural objects, cultural information in terms of publications, films, those types of things as well. And I know they're part of this project as well. You then have data.gov, which is again across all the federally held, I think actually maybe even state-based. Federally held data is meant to be made available through data.gov, but you also then have Indigenous institutions or organisations, for instance, First Languages Australia, the Gambai map as well, where people are, you know, talking about languages, giving their voice and images and language that they're talking about there. Similarly, I think, you know, I've just put here the CSIRO's data, but most universities also have their data access portals that they're meant to be able to provide that context. One way that I sort of look at this sort of data ecosystem, and people have talked about the data ecosystem, is this concept of data. And again, I'm coming from a science or research organisation perspective, that concept of data to science, to the impact or the use that you want to achieve out of the use of that data. You know, you can look at that, who owns that data? It's collected in different platforms or through different mechanisms. You may aggregate it into large databases or repositories. Then somebody looks and does some analysis on that, and then you use it for a particular purpose, or it has an outcome that you want to achieve, whether it's to help make decisions, to inform decisions, and that may have an impact in one form or another. But to make that data flow, you look at this, and I know this Border project talks about the social architecture. You know, how is that sharing to make that information flow? And so I think that's a really useful way of thinking of potentially where, you know, the traditional knowledge labels or other mechanisms help that flow, that sharing of information. FAIR is one mechanism that can do that in the nature of the data. Similarly, concepts like APIs where computers can talk to one another and you can suck data from one thing to another, in my highly technical language. But you look at this also from a Indigenous data context. You know, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different Indigenous data that's held in non-Indigenous institutions, but there's also a lot of Indigenous data, both in knowledge and statistical type data, that's held by communities as well. And there's need in that flow of information. What is that decision? And a lot of people have talked about that decision, that Indigenous-led decision, whether or not to share that information or retain it within their own system or not. And those databases can be private, as I mentioned, or they can also be made publicly available. And again, what is the Indigenous-led research or analysis that happens around that? For a particular purpose, and you know, we've heard lots of different examples of that. It could be around healthy people, it can be cultural, it can be new business opportunities, understanding what's happening. So there's these understanding what those uses and that impact is wanting to be achieved. And where we're looking at this, where we're trying to bring it to the TK labels as one mechanism, is how do these sort of social architectural type things like care, like the labels, like Indigenous data sovereignty, for instance, help that flow, recognising it's not a one-way flow. And I think that's another important concept to think about here, that while information may go this way, it also needs to go back to inform some of the original collection, what you're collecting, and the design of those databases and aggregators.
So, over to me. So we want to just briefly talk a bit about the system of TK and BC labeling. In many ways, it's one of the more developed systems, and that's why we're using it as a way into the questions. It's not that we think it is the ideal system, that it's perfect now. Part of the point of the TK and the BC labels is they have flexibility in them for any one community or people who may be working with them to interpret them, as you'll see in a minute. So let's start with what existed before and what was needed. So traditional IP is very much about ownership. So that question earlier, should we talk in terms of ownership? Should we talk in terms of custody? Should we talk more collectively in some sense? Traditional IP, and there may be legal people who can do this better than me, was very much about copyrights and registering it. And it was very much about doing so that you could make a profit off of it. It was much less about acknowledging the history, very much not about acknowledging collectivity or communities from where things came from, and very much eye on the prize of making money off of it. More recently, we've seen things like Creative Commons labeling, which have come into place particularly with so-called open science and other things. This is sort of putting rules on reuse of something, but making it available to others under certain conditions. And that's supposed to foster more sharing, more reuse, and so on. In some way, TK and BC labels are the continuation of this trajectory, if you will. Far away from ownership models, more to custodian, and more to, I guess, the devil's in the details. You know, what doesn't matter is like putting the stamp on it. What matters is in any individual case of a piece of data, what is it that we know about it, what don't we know, signaling the lack of information around things like provenance and so on, acknowledging where it's come from, and acknowledging what it might be used for into the future, according to the traditional custodians' understandings of that. So just to take you a little bit into the TK labels, as we said at the beginning, this comes out of a group called Local Context. It has been fairly well developed in detail and deployed particularly in the museum sector, especially in North America. But also one of the main proponents and advocates is a Maori academic from New Zealand, and so there's been some trials in New Zealand. It has not been as extensively utilized in Australia, so this is a good opportunity to think about it. These kinds of labels use very basic kind of icons to try to make certain kinds of attributions, things that almost in some way serve as a universal language without needing translation, hence the symbols. If you hate any particular symbol, you always can renegotiate it. These are not sort of set in stone in any way.
Oh no, the symbols are.
The symbols are, but you know, how you interpret it is,
that's
right?
how you interpret it.
So yeah. So if you hate a particular one, you could use a different one and reinterpret, right? You know what I mean? So I think some people really don't like some of the symbols, but they're intended to just be very basic. They're not trying to replicate anything in particular, right? So just to highlight a few of them, we've got TK attribution. So there's a few different levels of this. To use this would be to acknowledge that there is traditional knowledge involved in a particular data point, if you will. It could be a piece of art, it could be a biological finding, it could be data about the environment, it could be a piece of music. It's supposed to cross different types of resources. So that one is about attribution, and it also then goes down into, there's reasons sort of when you use it and how you use it. But as you'll see in a minute, when it's applied in any particular context, it's interpreted. And that's the point, that you're not really hanging on these labels alone. It comes with context, hence local context, right? Seasonal, which, you know, frankly, may not be the right kind of label for this context, but in some contexts is really, really important. That this knowledge only makes sense, you know, in a seasonal sense and so on. Culturally sensitive perhaps makes more sense, and that comes along with who has the right to access it, who has the right to reuse it, and so on. But it marks out some zone of cultural sensitivity. And then there's other types of labels that go into that in more detail. So here we have an example out of the Pacific Northwest, just over the border of Canada, sort of crosses between Canada, just over the US border. And basically here they're using the traditional knowledge label to attribute. They then interpret it in their First Nations language to mean literally this is about name and place. And they then give more information. The website is representing the true knowledge and history of this First Nation peoples. And what we're taking the attribution label to mean, they say, is name and place. And so that's what we're taking it to mean. They use it in their collection so that when someone comes in from the outside naively, let's say, they see that this is traditional knowledge, that it needs to be attributed in a particular way, and here's the context, and here's how you would attribute it. So Steph's going to talk about BC labeling.
Excellent. So another example that as they were developing up the TK labels, primarily in a cultural institution context, they recognised as well there's a lot of biocultural information there as well, and that may come from, that sits in biological collections, that sits through surveys or land management. And also we have, remembering, we also have the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Nagoya Protocol that talks about access and benefit sharing and free and prior formed consent, FPIC. And I think these labels were, the biocultural labels, were really intended to sort of look at that biocultural and genetic information, and potentially even digital sequence information as well. And again, those labels are trying to indicate certain protocols, provenance, whether that's around provenance, it came from here, this biological resource came from, or this biocultural information came from here. That consent was given to make that information example, hence the consent verified one as well. That as that community is also identified that they're actually happy for that information to be used for research purposes, not necessarily commercial purposes. There are some examples where communities may want those resources to be used and commercialisation opportunities generated from those resources that are on the country or land. And hence there's an example there of we're open to commercialisation, come and talk to us, and these labels talk to those key concepts. One key thing to remember with the labels is there's a difference between labels and notices. We should really talk about TK labels and notices. So the TK labels are really only applied by communities as well. They can be applied, and they can ask institutions to apply that information or those labels to information that sits in somewhere else, and hence there's a dialogue that happens. And Local Context has developed up something called the Local Context Hub, what allows that dialogue to happen between an institution that may hold Indigenous data and the community that's developing up the data and want to essentially repatriate or acknowledge or make more discoverable that information, or change actually what that the references that exist around that. But what was recognised as Local Context were working on those, that institutions are there as well, and while it's not their responsibility to create those labels, it's to adopt them, that they needed to create these notices that researchers or institutions can apply to their databases or their collections that they have. And these are really then visible commitments by those institutions to actually look at and work with, collaborate around the Indigenous data that they may be holding as well. And it's to create this degree of transparency and integrity in the research that is available. And this is an example. For instance, the University of Tasmania has placed on their open access repository that information around. We're open to collaborate with Indigenous communities to access that. Again, they sit within the context of the care principles, and really what we're wanting to look at as well as this part of this project is to sort of look at they're a form of, the TK labels are potentially a form of operationalising those care principles as well. But one of the sort of key things, I think this is a really interesting way to also look at the TK labels and what they're trying to do and also communicate. So a suite of those labels are about the provenance. So it's understanding the provenance and where that information came from originally from Indigenous peoples. And it may be, hence the attribution, we want to share those types of labels. Partly what I think is really interesting around the labels as well is it's embedding components of protocols. Those protocols around cultural protocols, that this information is men's only, as an example, or this is shared or culturally sensitive information. So embedding components of Indigenous protocols, cultural protocols, is really important. And there's this other key component around the labels about those permissions that are granted. So often, that information will already be an institution, or people may want to share that data. And this is really creating a sort of form of, not data license as such, but it's creating an acknowledgement that these are the positions of how we want this to be made available, that we want this to be used only for outreach, that we have actually verified that, yes, it is from us and we're happy to share it, that we only want it to be used for commercial or non-commercial purposes. So this is a really great way to sort of look at those different ways that the labels sort of embed protocols, permissions and provenance.
So what we want to do is take you to some of our questions for discussion. And we want to really hear from you sort of in a stepwise manner about some of the things we're considering in this sub-project. So the first sort of sets of questions are just simply perhaps to have a bit of a brief discussion about how the labels and notices operate so that we have sort of an understanding of what they do, what they don't do, and so on. The second is then we really want to pick your brains, particularly people who have collections in their institution, people who are curators, people who are in communities that have particular collections, about what you might see as the benefits of applying this in your context, and what would the challenges be, or the limitations, or what would you like to see in the mix? What are the real problems? And finally, we're still looking for case studies. So we're looking for examples where you think these might be helpful or useful in the Australian context, so we can consider how it would work, what would need to be in place for it to work, including the resources, the training, and the capabilities, right? Yeah. So want to start with number one?
Yeah, we'd like to eye off a few people here in terms of, can you give me some example, who here is sort of managing or aware of or looks after sort of bicultural information? You have a bicultural information person? Up this end? Oh, here's one as well. How about in a cultural institution, so a museum, a GLAM sector person? Is there anybody from the GLAM sector?
That's you as well. There we go. Yeah.
Yep. No, but I'd like to have a chat to you as well. So are you aware, I'll ask one more question, I should have asked this first question. Who's actually heard of of the TK labels and bicultural labels or local context? Excellent. I would all recommend you doing a big Google search and watching some of the videos around explaining this. They can probably explain it better than Rachel and I can as well. So really recommend you having that. So, yeah. I'd love to have your question.
Well, yeah, Michael Aird, I'm Director of the University of Queensland Anthropology Museum and sort of been working in research and museums since 1985. And I guess the main thing is I've seen, lots of attempts of this type of database type setup with levels of access, levels of control, levels of permission. And I guess the big thing that my other big interest in, particularly from South East Queensland, is looking at native title, general community politics, native title politics, and it's such a complex area where even where there is determined native title claims, where if there's a determined native title claim, you may think it's very simple to go to that body, prescribed corporate body, and get permission to act for access. There's often a huge number of people who are very disgruntled with that authoritative body. So permissions, any type of authority permission can just prove to be so complex because of the complexities in the community. And then what I'm finding more recently is the complexities of institutions trying to tick boxes with reconciliation action plans. And instead of, in a sense, being driven just to do the right thing and govern things in a good way, they're trying to govern things so it looks good on reconciliation action plans So you're getting forms. So essentially you're getting Reconciliation Action Plan officials deciding on collection policy, which to me can be very dangerous because they're sort of two different things. So you're getting, so forms are being developed, processes are being introduced that are essentially just creating, I guess, opportunities for gatekeepers to prevent other people from accessing material. And then so people are being denied access, Aboriginal people are being denied access, and yet the process is being actually framed as cultural safety. So people are getting hurt by something that's getting called cultural safety.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to understand some of those, institutional barriers or processes that have a real impact on I think, the labels is actually to make some of that information more discoverable. It's often hidden in institutions, and I think, Nick has been talking about different mechanisms to make it discoverable through a catalogue, but the labels are one mechanism in the metadata, I suppose, to sort of indicate here it is, and here's the certain rights associated with it as well. And that's why we're really interested in that second question. What are the barriers that you mentioned tick boxing as an institutional barrier and gatekeeping as a key one?
But I think the one that you raised is a really good one, and it's one that another one that you've raised is, putting the labels on is one thing, but the hard part is putting the processes in place and having a sustainable infrastructure that's going to, make it clear who should be approached to get the permission or whatever else. And I think that's why it's less about, applying the labels and more about, spelling out what that infrastructure might look like, taking learnings from elsewhere about what's worked and what hasn't, but really thinking about, in the Australian context, what do we know about the complexities, particularly where there's multiple communities involved or large communities with multiple speakers or, multiple kind of pathways for giving permission. That's where it does indeed get very tricky. Yeah.
So if a researcher wants to access material in a collection, and if they're told they have to then fill out a form and go out in the community and get permissions, then they get permissions off, one, two, 5 people, however many. They bring that form back, then somebody in that institution has to decide the validity and the authority of those people who have signed. So how does a library director or a museum director, or who makes that decision?
Yeah, I totally agree. Did anybody have any other questions about the labels?
Stephanie and Rachel, we have some questions coming through online.
Sure.
Online participant Kalinda Griffiths, if you could please ask your question and introduce yourself and what organisation you're from.
We're happy to...
Hi everyone. Kalinda Griffiths, I'm a Yarwal woman. My country's in Broome, Western Australia. I'm calling in from Larrakia country, and I'm with the Centre for Big Data Research and Health at the University of New South Wales. I've got 2 questions/comments, and the first is just around the discussions that's happening at the moment around mechanisms of voice, so enabling processes that ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can be a part of the development of those sort of, those protocols and permissions, and a question about how that work gets developed. It's something that we're asking a question about, one, on this program of work, but also within the health research sector as well, particularly in genomics. Question about how that's been done so far. And secondly, is around accountability. So I'm just wondering if, say, we do get up the ideal processes around TK and BC labels, how do we ensure that people are going through the right processes? Like within health research, we know that people have to go through ethics, but even then, at the end of the day, if they want to publish on it, ethical review doesn't necessarily mean that they've done the work they said that they're going to do as well. So I just want to put that to you guys.
Sure, and I think that's one of the key concepts from a local context perspective is that the labels are actually developed by the community themselves, that they're a mechanism to try and reflect some of their protocols and some of the voice that they want attached to data that's sitting somewhere else, or even their own data. So I would hope, I mean, that's the intention of that process around the TK and the BK labels, that there only can be applied by the relevant community around that particular data set. So that's that. Potentially that hopefully answers your accountability question. I'm just trying to think what the first one was. So,
well, putting in place the sort of mechanisms of voice. I like that expression. I mean, I think the accountability question, though, I mean, you compare it to sort of ethics committees, and there are better and worse processes for ethics committees, right? There are some that actually try to follow through and make sure what they say was done, and there's others, again, it's a tick box exercise like Michael was describing earlier. But I think this goes sort of full circle back. There would need to be clear governance in place, and there would then need to be appropriate training and appropriate mechanisms for making sure what is being done is what people say is being done. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that local contexts are looking at, to the hub, where these labels can be developed and then, you know, shared with an institution who may be holding that particular data, is really, I think they're looking at how do we manage that. I know that they're looking at how do they manage that accountability, that it's being used in the right way. There are any sort of questions about the labels as well. Again, we're not as clear as Maui and Jane, who often do a lot of these presentations around the TK labels, or Corey.
I mean, I have a question. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Go, Sam. Yep.
I'd be interested.
Yeah, I just wanted talking about process. I think one of the videos I'd seen, Jane was talking about this. They were talking about one particular community that they'd gone through a relatively small data set and labelled, and just the time it took to do that in a meaningful way. Could you kind of speak to that?
Yeah, totally agree. And I think that was your other question, Kalinda, was about the resourcing required. And I think that's just a fundamental failing that we have from a funding perspective across in the whole Indigenous data space as well. That support at the local level to do that. Because if you're looking at legacy, you know, the legacy data, there's like phenomenal amounts of data in GLAM and collections and stuff like that. To do that would be, you know, ridiculous. So there needs to be that to be recognised. You know, the National Collaborative Research Infrastructures, the NCRIS facilities, you know, there's hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent on actually trying to bring together that data, but less so at that community level where the data comes from as well. So I'm hoping within, you know, if we hear that through our discussions on this as an important point, that there needs to be support and resourcing for people to actually apply and use those labels. Not just that support needs to be at that local level, not necessarily at the institutional level. That's their job. They should be doing that. They have enough, you know, the CSIROs, the universities of the world should have the resources to be able to do that themselves.
Yeah. But to answer, I mean, another part of your question, I think implicitly, is that it will be much easier to do it prospectively than retrospectively. And I think it's for multiple reasons. One is just the sheer amount. The second is provenance is horrendous in lots of them. And when I first started looking at this, I come out of a background having studied scientific collections. You know, I was just worried that this just seems to be just too difficult, just too hard. But I think the more and more I've talked to people, read about how they've used it, you know, the notices are probably a fabulous first step. To just at least say, we know there's this gap. We know provenance is not well established, but we also acknowledge that, you know, there is Indigenous knowledge in this collection. We can't tell you exactly, but we're working on it. We're making a commitment. It's a tiny first step, but it's probably better than what we have now. The second thing is, I think we're not at a bad point in time because there's all this thinking about metadata going on, a lot more. There's all this thinking about what our collections should look like, how they should be prioritized. There's thinking about how to train people. And so I think if in some way something like this can come along with all that thinking and that investment, it's a good time. There's lots of digitization going on. So may as well throw this in as part of the metadata, knowing that it's probably extremely difficult, right?
Not so much the questions you had up there, but both within CSIRO and the University of Adelaide, there's lots of amazing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. You've both acknowledged your positionality, which is as non-Indigenous people. Why isn't an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people up here with you at this conference about Indigenous data governance and sovereignty, talking to these labels? And what are you doing to empower Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be standing up next to you right now?
Sure,
You had a-
I acknowledge that as well. And so we did have an Aboriginal man on the project as well, but he left, and we're currently in the process of identifying another person who's coming on board through the mechanism to be able to do that. So, sorry, it was yeah, that's all I can talk to.
And that's just happened in the last few weeks.
Yep.
You know, we're working closely with the people at our institutions, particularly about the particular collections. But the meta level project in some way, the person that we had has literally just left. So well aware that that would be essential.
Can I just cross-sector for a second? That is a really great call out, and it's a really good conversation to be had. I think it's very central and it's really important. I think one of the other things to kind of be mindful of is that the project that this particular team is working on is also co-situated within the large project as a whole. So whilst that doesn't ameliorate or excuse, that's not what I'm trying to do, it is part of a bigger moving picture, and it is about that global thinking always. So just wanted to acknowledge that as well. But by all means too, there is very much a phrase that I live by, and it's no one's ever died from accountability. So it's all right to have tough conversations and relevant questions. But yeah, thank you.
Does anybody else have some? Maggie?
Stephanie, just to say that the Youth Justice Commission is using TK labels.
Yes,
and so TK labels are being applied to all the knowledge that comes in via submissions, Nusamuyup and other things. So it is much easier to apply as things come in rather than retrospective.
So could you tell us a bit more, Maggie, about how that's going so far and any...
Well, it's going very slowly because we've only just started taking evidence. Okay. So we've had our first 2 weeks, 4 weeks of taking evidence. We've talked to 7 elders now and the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and a co-chair of the First Peoples Assembly. So knowledge labels are being applied to all of those testimonies and will be applied to all the written submissions that come in over the next 3 years.
Brilliant. We'd love to talk to you about how that would work in that, because I think part of what we'd like to see is look at those different contexts and mechanisms and the ways that the labels can be applied.
Yeah, and look, it's quite a challenge because we have had to design our information system, which of course we cannot do using government information systems. We have to develop our own, but we also have to design it so that it can accept the meta tags, the TK label tags.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a big thing. That's one of those other questions around potential barriers, is looking at the systems. So while there's a resourcing issue as a potential barrier, and understanding around what the TK label's about to do, it's actually looking at the different bits and pieces of software. We all have our own software that has all its different fields. How do you put in another field or create a field or identify a different field as well? And I think for many institutions that can be hard because this is what my IT system is. And so, I think that's a really important point to make.
We've had the benefit of having Maui and Jane working with us directly, but obviously they are just 2 people and they can't be available to support every group globally that want to use TK labels. So,
Totally. And that's what I'd recommend to everybody, to reach out to the local context hub as well, and look at some of the resources there as well and go in knowledgeable before asking silly questions. Nick?
Thanks. On one of the slides, you showed 3 labels, and there was a description about whether this label does or doesn't, or when this applies. Could you just talk us through just one of those? Maybe that first one. There was one about, I think it was traditional attribution or something like that.
It's up again if you could put it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So there we go. TK attribution. So if I've got a general purpose catalogue with heaps of stuff in it, when would I realise that I should apply that label?
Well, you wouldn't apply it. That would be the first point as well. Mm-hmm. So you would... A community would say there is this label, and they would say, "Can you?" Oh, sorry. They would then you would then take what they have said, how they want that data to be attributed. Because often so much data has no attribution. And
then I would put the label on to say there is a traditional attribution statement with this data set. This label indicates it exists. What the statement is they've told us.
Is in the detail there as well. So it's a little bit like the community creates that text that describes what attribution means to them. The idea is because there's so much data that has no attribution. For instance, I'm intrigued to see, you see often information was collected from somebody. I see a lot of in museums. I was here at the NGV the other day. You see the labels next to a piece of artwork that says unknown. Though they've changed that now to ancestor or was once known. So that's an example of not having attribution by saying unknown. That person wasn't unknown, it's just that somebody didn't collect that information or somebody didn't ask who should I attribute this to, this object to. So that's where I think this attribution concept is very important, because if you look at in our images, a lot of our images that we have online of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, for instance, it may just say Aboriginal person. It just doesn't actually attribute who they are, where they come from. I think, Sam, you were talking about this before, or was it Ollie, that we often see, we actually don't give that proper attribution. And that's the intention of that part of acknowledgement. We do that already through, our data. We have a CC BY. The BY means attribution. So we attribute where that data comes from, and often a lot of Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous data has no attribution associated with it.
But would you expect, so that label's highlighting that there is a traditional attribution, would you expect that to be alongside or different to, maybe it's CC BY, some government department all the way down, but then there's there's an additional label which is calling out a different thing, and it's not present on all of them, it's present on certain data sets. How would I would have to assess that such a attribution should be created, because I've got lots of them. Now I've got to kind of do an assessment of the data set to work out whether, if it's about a warship or something, maybe not. But
and that's what we've got to try, and I suppose that's the whole point of the project, is to look at some of those issues.
Particularly mixed collections where you have a lot of stuff that may or may not be in purview, where you've got multiple communities represented. Hodgepodge collections at many museums are just, they need to be recurated. Everybody knows that. This is one piece of that puzzle, but this is a particularly tricky one. So other things that they're really commonly used for, where they've been used, is, for example, to get the language right. That seems really minor, but not using the slang or the sort of garbage down Anglo kind of ways of describing things, using the language that the local community wants to be used about it for the place or the person or whatever the object is or whatever else. So, lots of things that museums have been doing anyway as they modernize, but doing it with lots more consciousness of the breadth of the sorts of things that are suffering from this neglect of attribution.
We had a raised hand online. Janet McDougall, did you have a question or comment?
Hi, from Australian Data Archive on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, still with the cold. I started looking at TK and BC labels. I was actually looking for Indigenous-led metadata to describe data on a project I'm working on with Jonah and the Ndiniyakwa Land Council, and I came across with Nick Carr and a few others that there's a lack of metadata to describe Indigenous collections. And so I've been in contact with local contexts so far, and we're not quite at that stage, but we'll hopefully be able to implement some of these labels going forward as the data unit's built. So we're a future user, and I don't know about going.
Love to chat to you more. And again, that's part of what we'd like to do, is to see who else is out there in Australia. We're aware of a few there.
Hi, so my name's Andrew. I'm a Porridurami man, and I'm at the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria working on our implementation of what we hope will be best practice Indigenous data sovereignty and governance policies. So I guess what I really want to drill down into is, what do you see as the main benefit to the community if we were to implement and use TK labelling, and then maybe too big without notice to the treaty process as a whole, the same benefit of using these in our internal policies?
Oh, it's a hard one for us to answer in that sense. You know, the intent expressed by sort of the local context group is to provide some of that a normative and educative. It has a normative and educative approach. They're not legally enforceable as such, but we really need to provide a mechanism for people to understand that this data has some sort of provenance or has some permissions or something associated with. So I suppose that's what's been expressed from a local context perspective as key mechanism. And because people are looking at those different ways, you know, Ray talked a lot, Ray talked about that operationalising, and it was fantastic. I'd love to see more detail that thing. And these are potentially one of those tools to operationalise those care principles and Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. So I think a lot of people are asking for tools. You know, those tools can be metadata, those tools can be catalogues, but it's not just the tools, it's also the broader governance as well. So yeah, so I couldn't answer that.
I mean, other things I think are that the TK and the BC labeling also pushes the question of benefit sharing, you know, sort of to the fore. It's not enforceable, but I think benefit sharing often just gets sort of a narrow connotation of if there's money to be made off of it, then we talk about benefit sharing. And that's not much of the time what's at issue or what people really care about. It's not the sort of knowledge that's going to be about that. But that doesn't change the fact that it needs to be attributed and acknowledged as Indigenous knowledge and treated with the appropriate respect and the appropriate structures. And I think doing so outside of a commercial model, saying there's all sorts of different ways. You're doing certain sorts of things, you need to build in training, you need to build in capability building. There's all sorts of things that can be a benefit that go well beyond the economic. So in some sense, I guess I'm flipping it around and saying the benefit is that it forces recognition that benefits have a very wide definition, that knowledge has a much wider definition than sort of the typical hegemonic Western Anglo science has recognized, particularly science, but also cultural, you know, institutions and so on. To treaty, well, I mean, it's all about making probably the biggest cultural change, you know, this country's ever seen, right? And in order to make cultural change, you have to change the way people think about things. And this is just one tiny step. But I think in many ways, sorry, I'm a philosopher by background, among other things, you have to change the categories people use, right? The concepts that they use. And if, you know, it's just all this stuff and the knowledge is Western, hegemonic, scientific, Anglo, you need to muddy that terrain and change the concepts. Once you do that, much the way land, you know, people think differently about land, they think differently about community, you got to get back to the very nature of how they understand the world. If you can do that, you know, treaty should come, setting aside the politics, which you can never set aside, right?
Jingler.
Oh, sorry.
It's very hard, sorry.
Jingler, everyone. Firstly, I just want to start by acknowledging country, and Uncle Dave's not here. I know Uncle Dave, I spent a bit of time with him on country, and it was great to see him welcome us here today. So, my name's Oliver Costello. I'm a Bundjalung man from Northern Rivers, New South Wales, and just want to thank Sam for tuning me into this space. It's been really great to kind of tune in and sort of see what's going on in this space. I've got more of a comment than a question. So I've got many hats and many interests, but today I'm here representing Bush Heritage Australia. I'm the project manager for Conservation Futures project, which is a partnership between Bush Heritage and Melbourne University. So we're setting out to create and we're very much in a development stage, so this has been really great. We're setting out to develop an integrated knowledge system that can help bring together cultural and ecological and sort of climate and other sort of country-based knowledge so we can help improve decision making.
Yep.
And really critical, and my interest is, like, I've founded the Fire Sticks Alliance and I've done a lot of work around cultural fire management, and obviously we saw the 2019-2020 fires. I live near Lismore, we've had these massive floods, and so when I think about how we manage country, I see massive gaps all over the place in understanding the cultural significance of places, cultural values, and being able to bring the recognition of, you know, what I understand country to be into a whole heap of decision making. And so what we're trying to do is work out how do we bring, I've got, you know, mainly based in New South Wales, but I'm aware of lots of other jurisdictions around just the inadequacy of a lot of cultural heritage systems, cultural heritage management systems to actually bring that data up. And so what we're trying to work out is how do we build a system that can have essentially, and there's been discussions about, and we're really interested in the labelling. I've had a bit of a look at local context, and we think visual language is critical, particularly in the spatial type network sort of that we want to display information in. But the challenge is, when we talk about community, well, how do we define community? And in some situations, it's much easier because we've got a settlement agreement or a native title group or a land council or something. It makes it a bit easier to engage. But in many parts of the landscape, there's a lot of differences of opinion within communities about who has access to knowledge, who are knowledge holders and whatnot. So how we're thinking about it is, why don't we create a space for knowledge holders to be able to share what they would like to share, and be able to sort of potentially create a platform so that individual users can spatially and temporally visualise the information that they're collecting in the field. Like, this is about knowledge of country. Like Uncle Dave said this morning, like, so much of this work is about the data is in the land. And if we want to manage country the right way, and so much of the background information that people are talking about links to that, the well-being of our families, our communities, health, education, all that knowledge of country is central to our identity and central to our practice. And then when we see wildfires and floods and all these impacts impacting on our country, that's affecting our livelihood. So how do we create that space to bring that knowledge forward and protect it, make sure that knowledge holders are able to control access to the information, share it within their families and their kin? And so I guess the comment it really is, and I guess the reach out is to people, if we're setting up a cultural advisory group and we're looking at data sovereignty, and I'm not sure if Joe's still here, but I had a few colleagues on the line today. But we're trying to work out for some of these really critical questions. And I guess I'm just reaching out for guidance, but also putting forward some of those pathways I think we're looking at. How do we visualise, whether it's these TK labels or other forms of visualisation, so that it makes it easy for people to see where data exists, and we can protect all those values that are really critical in the landscape.
Yeah, thanks. That's really good.
I mean, I think you've also helped to answer part of Andrew's question, is what's the benefit? I mean, reuse is enormously valuable, both to communities and beyond. And the problem is there's so much data out there that just sits. Like you said, there's so much data out there and we don't know what's out there. And even when we do, does anyone ever use it for anything? So there's the recreating the wheel, and then there's ignoring all this knowledge. And I think the kind of project you're on kind of probably combines both, right? And the benefit is also for things like land management planning, environmental planning, and so on, by recognizing all of this and making it visually accessible.
I can give some real life examples. Like in a lot of situations in fire management, for example, which is my strong space, we'll see agencies looking at heritage management systems. So come up and say, here's let's say a midden site where they've put a containment line or a fire trail or something in the past, and it becomes quite a sensitive issue. So they'll make a decision, because they don't want to impact on that site, that they'll backburn or they'll let a fire run into another part of the landscape and potentially have a much greater impact on the cultural values, because the midden site, has a lot of values, but it is also showing that people have been collectively gathering there for thousands of years, and they may have been eating a lot of shells, but it wasn't all they were eating. And a lot of those values, those story places, really important values in the landscape are not represented. And there's not a mechanism. And it's not necessarily about, knowledge holders giving that information to those decision makers. It's being able to identify who those knowledge holders are. So when there's an incident control team saying, what do we do here? They know who to talk to. And there's protocols in place to be able to manage that relationship and that information, because we are, for me, this is, I think it's really great that we're looking at what's in all the data and all the background, but there's more knowledge out there in the landscape, and we need to be empowering our communities, our elders and our young people to be capturing that information, protecting it and living the practice. It's not about it doesn't have to be about, the past. It's like the only way to really, learn about fire is to practice fire, is to be practicing and identifying values, and values are changing as well as we see climate and we see communities understand their values differently. Our values change. There's plenty of things that we're highly dependent on as food resources in the past that are now threatened species, and we would want to see them protected. So being able to kind of communicate that information is really critical going forward.
how do you think data, I totally agree in that practice, how do you think data can support, the question is, does data support that? What does data support? How does data potentially support practice?
I think there's some really great. Michael Fletcher-Shawn was here earlier, and he's a part of the project. He's at Melbourne Uni here, and he would have loved to be in this session, but he had to go. He had some family commitments. We did some presentations at the Fire and Climate conference that's happening at Albert Park yesterday, and we had Amy Christensen from Canada as well. We had a keynote session talking about cultural fire and values, and they both had some really amazing examples, but one really amazing point was Michael's been doing all this work looking at vegetation and climate changes, and he could show, and I don't want to tell his stories, but just as an example, he could show through his work that there's a correlation between colonisation and the massacres of our people and changes in vegetation and fire. And there's really strong correlations there. So being able to kind of go out and access that information, there's a lot of space, the data that he's collecting, but also having knowledge holders out there being able to, when he says all those things, and from my fire work, I understand that because I know what's happening to shrub encroachment in lots of areas because of inappropriate fire regimes, so I know what happens when people stop burning country, and so I can correlate that data. So if we've got knowledge holders out there being able to talk about, in this place here along this ridge, this species is important to us, but it actually belongs down here in the gully, and then if we can record that information, so this is where this species is, this is where these other species are. This is our songline to our durable site for our burrabi, our koala, and we can document that in the landscape. When ecologists turn around to us and say, "Oh, we don't know how to determine what healthy country is," we can actually turn around and say, "Well, let us show you in the landscape, and let's change the." There's a whole heap of really, this is a bit technical and maybe a bit specific, but there's a whole heap of different management actions and planning frameworks that really are destroying our landscapes, and they're under the name of conservation. So the key issues are around most fire management prescriptions talk about fire frequency being a bad thing for country, but they don't talk about seasonality, intensity, severity, extent, all those other things that really matter. So what we see is an exclusion of fire in a whole heap of areas. We've seen guidelines develop that essentially prescribe fire regimes in landscapes, which means that we end up with massive wildfires like we just saw, and we see huge devastation of not just our heritage sites, but to me, more importantly, the values that define them, the plants, the animals, the heritage places, all that knowledge is there in the landscape. But if we don't have that relationship with the land managers and we don't have that data in the systems where people are making decisions, then it's almost extinct.
And it goes to Maggie's point there about that concept of data for governance. It's all those forms of governance and practice as well. So